Good afternoon, students. In today's session, we are going to discuss about hypothesis and its sources, types. So, first of all, formulation of hypothesis. Science proceeds with observation, hypothesis formulation, and hypothesis testing. Hypothesis refers to a tentative solution to a problem. It refers to assumptions that are made in advance before starting the process of work or research. After testing the hypothesis through various statistical tests, researcher can accept or reject the hypothesis. If the hypothesis is accepted, then the researcher can replicate the results. If it is rejected, then researcher needs to refine or modify his or her results. So, if it is accepted, the researcher can replicate the results. But if it is rejected, if your hypothesis is rejected, then researcher can refine or modify the results. By stating a specific hypothesis, the researcher narrows the focus of the data collection effort and is able to design a data collection procedure which is aimed at testing the plausibility of the hypothesis as a possible statement of the relationship between the terms of the research problem. Therefore, it is always useful to have a clear idea and vision about the hypothesis. It is essential for the research questions as the researcher intends to verify, as it will directly and greatly help in the interpretation of the results. So, it's very important. Sources of, let's talk about various sources of hypothesis. The major sources of hypothesis are culture. Culture in a particular place and time is the collection of ways of behaving and adopting and understanding the norms of society or adjusting ourselves according to that. So, while formulating a hypothesis for any work, culture should be examined. If we want to examine trends within a particular country, for this purpose, we will research the traditions. We will research about family structures. We will find about norms, values, region, and education system of that country. Researcher's personal experience. Researcher uses her or his mind on the basis of his or her knowledge, his or her personal experience. So it can be a source to formulate hypothesis, like his or her experiences, or background knowledge, previous knowledge, what you call it, previous knowledge. So researcher uses his or her mind on the basis of his or her previous knowledge, experience, and propose those points for the eradication of a social problem by creating a strong hypothesis. Increased study experience contributes to higher level of preparation. Definitely, the more you study, the more it becomes better. The more you have strong voice, the better it becomes. So your previous knowledge, your study helps a lot in formulating hypothesis, thinking and imagination. A researcher's imaginative thinking and creativity often aid in the formulation of a hypothesis. A researcher's personal ideas and reasoning abilities will contribute to a greater amount of hypothesis formulation as well as control over the problem. Scientific theory. All the details relating to the problem can be clarified by theory. A main source of hypothesis formulation is a scientific theory. The theory used by a researcher can satisfy the requirements of making it, since the theory explains the facts that are known, or theory supports the facts, clears up things. So it explains, it interprets, or it supports the facts which are known. Next is previous researches. Previous research study is a basis for the establishment of a concrete hypothesis. If for a particular field a researcher uses previous knowledge of a phenomenon, then another researcher applies her or his approach and formulates her or his own. Observation. Observation is important in the consideration and undertaking of a research issue. A good hypothesis is developed through the compilation of previous facts and current facts which are relevant to the problem. So, different sources of hypothesis are culture, researcher's personal experience, his or her thinking and imaginative power, scientific theory, previous researches, or which you call review of related literature, and observation. Now, types of hypothesis. Any assumption that we seek to validate through investigation is called hypothesis. Remember, any assumption that we seek to validate through investigation is called hypothesis. Hence, theoretically, there should be one type of hypothesis. on the basis of the investigation, that is research hypothesis. So theoretically, there should be one type of hypothesis on the basis of the investigation, that is research hypothesis. However, because of the conventions in scientific inquiries and wordings used in the construction of the hypothesis, hypothesis can be defined, can be classified into several types. So, we will discuss them. First is research hypothesis. The research hypothesis could be understood in terms of simple research hypothesis and complex research hypothesis. A simple research hypothesis predicts the relationship between a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. Remember, simple research hypothesis predicts the relationship between a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. A complex hypothesis a complex hypothesis predicts the relationship between two or more independent variables and two or more dependent variables. So, a research hypothesis must be stated in a testable form for its proper evaluation, and it should indicate a relationship between variables in clear, concise, and understandable language. Research hypothesis is further classified being directional or non-directional. Directional. These are usually derived from theory. They may imply that the researcher is intellectually committed to a particular outcome. They specify the expected direction of the relationship between variables. That is, the researcher predicts not only the existence of a relationship but also its nature. Non directional. It is used when there is little or no theory. When findings or previous studies are contradictory. They may imply impartiality. Do not stipulate the direction of the relationship. Null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is useful tool in testing the significance of difference. In its simplest form, the hypothesis asserts that there is no true difference between two population means, and the difference found between sample mean is accidental and unimportant, that is, arising out of fluctuation of sampling by chance. Traditionally, null hypothesis states that there is zero relationship between terms of the hypothesis. For example, there is no relationship between intelligence and height. There is no relationship between personality and behavior. So, the null hypothesis is an important component of the decision making methods of inferential statistics. If the difference between the sample of means is found significant, the researcher can reject the null hypothesis. If the difference between the samples of means is found significant, the researcher can reject the null hypothesis. It indicates that the differences have statistically significant and acceptance of null hypothesis indicates that the differences are due to chance. Null hypothesis should always be a specific hypothesis. It should not state about or approximately a certain value. The null hypothesis is often stated in the following way. H0. Now, alternative hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is symbolized as H1, is the hypothesis that specifies those values that the researcher believes to hold true, and the researcher hopes that sample data will lead to acceptance of this hypothesis as true. Alternative hypothesis represents all other possibilities that it indicates the nature of relationship. The alternative hypothesis is like the mean of population of those who have the vocabulary is greater than the mean of those who lack the vocabulary. The alternative hypothesis is like the mean of population of those who have the vocabulary and is greater than the mean of those who lack the vocabulary. In this example, the alternative hypothesis is that the experimental population had higher mean than the controls. This is called directional hypothesis because researcher predicted that the high vocabulary children would significantly differ in one particular direction from the low vocabulary children. Sometimes researchers predicts only that two groups will differ from each other, but the researcher doesn't know which group will be higher. This is non-directional hypothesis. Directional hypothesis. Typically, these are taken from theory. They can mean that a specific result is intellectually dedicated by the researcher. They specify the expected direction of the relationship between variables. Not only the presence of a relationship, but also its nature is predicted by the researcher. Non-directional hypothesis. It is used when there is little or no theory, or when findings of previous studies are contradictory. They may imply impartiality. Associative hypothesis. In this type of research process, the relationship between variables, once one variable changes, the opposite variable also changes. But these do not uh, explain cause and effect. Complex hypothesis. A complex hypothesis is a hypothesis that describes the relation between more than two variables. Hypothesis testing. One of the significant aspects of research is hypothesis testing. One of the significant aspects of research is hypothesis testing. Hypothesis is a tentative statement that is investigated during the process of research. So, hypothesis pertains to certain phenomena and which is based on a theory. Data is then collected by the researcher in order to validate the hypothesis. So, one of the most significant aspects of research is hypothesis testing. It is a tentative statement that is investigated during the process of research. Hypothesis pertains to a certain phenomenon and is based on a theory. Data is then collected by the researcher in order to validate the hypothesis. Thus, the null hypothesis is rejected or accepted by a researcher based on the results obtained. Hypothesis testing is also referred to as a process involving statistical decision making with regard to population value, that is based on the sample value. Though, while drawing inference, one needs to ensure that hypothesis is not incorrectly accepted or rejected due to results that are influenced by some chance factor or confounding factors. Do the facts support hypothesis or they happen to be contrary? This is the usual question which should be answered while testing hypothesis. Various parametric and non-parametric tests have been developed for this purpose. The hypothesis may be tested through the use of one or more of such tests, depending upon the nature and object of research inquiry. Hypothesis testing will result in either accepting or rejecting it. Steps in hypothesis testing. Null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis are specified first. Step 2, a level of significance is selected. This level of significance could be at 0.05 level or 0.01 level. Either we will take it at 0.05 level or we'll check it 0.01 level. So the term significance in the context of statistics implies probably true. That indicates that results are free from chance factor at the specified level of significance. For example, if there exists a significant difference in job satisfaction of job satisfaction of government and private school employees, then the researcher could either be 95%, that is 0.05 level of significance, confident, or 99%, 0.01 level of significance. So confident about the results obtained. This is because when carrying out research with human participants, 100% accuracy can never be achieved. That is why it is taken at 0.05 level or zero point zero 0.01 level, because it can never be 100% accurate. Thus, there could be 5% or 1% chance that the results are due to some change, chance, or confounding factors. Whether the null hypothesis is accepted or rejected will depend on whether the statistical value obtained after data analysis is more or less than the table value. Table for various statistical techniques are generally provided to the researcher at the end of books, or some table is there in statistical methods books, research methods books, which is generally specified at zero point zero 0.05 or zero point zero 0.01 level of significance. So if the obtained value is higher than the table value, then the null hypothesis is rejected. And if the obtained value is lower than the table value or less than the table value, then the null hypothesis is accepted. So if the obtained value is higher than the table value, then the null hypothesis is rejected. And if the obtained value is lower than the table value, then the null hypothesis is accepted. Based on the parameter specified in the null hypothesis, the statistics is calculated. A sample is selected by the researcher and the data is collected. So statistics is thus obtained from the sample, which is representative, and is then used in order to make an estimation about the population parameters. And the last step, is made whether to accept or reject the null hypothesis. In this regard, the p-value or probability level is computed as we just discussed, and accordingly decision is taken by the researcher. If the value is higher than the table value, then the hypothesis is rejected, and if it is lower than the table value, then the null hypothesis is accepted by the researcher. In our next session, we will talk about one-tailed or two-tailed tests.